Welcome to educators.com. I'm Shravanti, your Hadoop instructor. In this module, we are going to discuss about Hive partitioning, types of Hive partitions, static partitions, dynamic partitions, partitioning examples, alter the partitions, and drop and recover the partitions, and finally the important points related to the partitioning. Hive partitioning. So when to use the partitioning in the Hive tables, and also what is the advantage of using the partitioning is nothing but, especially if you are executing a query, in that query, in the where clause, every time you are referring the columns, a specific columns you are referring every time in the where clause to filter the data. Here what happens is, without partition, whenever you are executing the query, it will first, whatever the million records are there, it will fetches 1 million records, and then it performs that, it applies that particular the filtering conditions on top of that in a non-partition tables. But it is very, very expensive when you are working with the larger tables and wherein the millions of records are available. So to improve the performance and to overcome the issues with the slow processing and expensive processing of these large tables in the non-partition tables, what we have is, we have something called a partitionings over here. As part of the partition, what we are going to do is, we are going to define a specific column, and that specific columns we are going to define a partition. So automatically, either under the user Hive warehouse directory or else any other external location, a subfolder is going to be created. That subfolders, those records related to those specific column values will be stored. For instance, you will be having a country column, and in that country column consisting of a lot of values like United States, India, Germany, and a lot of values are available. So what happens here is, whatever the table you created, I mean, your data is always either stored either in the user Hive warehouse directory or else any other external location. So in those folders, a subfolder gets created, like country is equal to US is the subfolder name. Similar way, country is equal to India is the subfolder name. Like that, a subfolder gets created, and whatever the belongs to that value country is equal to US, those specific records will be going into that subfolder. So here the advantage is, whenever I execute a query, it doesn't need to go through millions of records. It can simply go and read that subfolder and fetches that particular records. So that is the advantage of the partitions, and that is how it improves the performance of these partitions. So if you see this over here, especially here, you need to define where users need to filter the data on a specific columns. Like in the previous example, as I mentioned you, suppose if you wanted to define on the country column, then you have to create a partition on that country. So your responsibility is to define a particular column where to put a partition on. So if you see the partition, this is the way to divide a table into the parts. That means based on the column values, whatever you are having it, based on that, a subfolder gets created as part of the partitioning. And here, we need to identify which are the common columns that are frequently used in your where clauses, so that we can put that, we can create a partition on top of that specific column. So as we discussed, if you use the partition, what it does is, it will help you in improve the performance and improve the faster querying on those specific data sets. And here, not only a single partition column, a table can consisting of a multiple partition columns, like country can have a one partition column, and also if you have a state can also have another subpartition. So here we can even have the partitioning and the subpartitionings as well in the multiple columns. How you are defining the partitions are nothing but at the time of creating the tables, you can use the partition by clause and you can specify which column you wanted to create a partition on. You see this, we have two types of partitions, static partition and another one is the dynamic partition. So what is static partition? Is nothing but the values, whatever the partitioning column values are there, these specific column values, you know the before execution itself. That means at the compilation time itself, you already know those values. So whenever you are inserting those partition column values, you will be specifying those, you will be entering those specific values as well. But where in case of a dynamic partition, you do not know any of the values at the compile time. Those gets executed as part of the execution time itself. So let me show you how to have these static partitions and the dynamic partitions. To see the example on the static partition, here we are creating a table called a client details, which consisting of a client ID and also the client name. And here we are using that partition by on that country. So here, as I mentioned you, we can use the partition by clause, and with the help of that we will be specifying the partition column. And the rest of the fields are same, like rest of the things, row format delimited, how your fields terminated, and everything is same. So let me log into the Cloudera Quick Start VM and show you how to execute this. I just logged into the Hive shell by simply typing the Hive, and then by using the create table, the same statement, whatever I have shown you, I copied over here, creating the client details, and by entering the client ID and the client name, the partition is the country is the partitioned clause which we are creating over here. Once the table is created, if you wanted to see whether the table what are the columns it consisting of and related to that, just give the describe table name and you can see client ID and client name and the country are the columns, and this country column is the partitioning column. You can see the partitioning information which is country over here. So how you will be loading the data as part of the static partition is nothing but, as we already know the value at the compile time itself, so we can directly load it with the help of those values into the specific partition. Let's assume if we are having the client from the US, and here while loading those data, we can directly specify country is equal to US values. The same way we can also specify the country is equal to India values, like that we can specify at the compile time itself. So let's prepare our input files, and then we can create our we can create the input files over here to load the data into these Hadoop. And to prepare the input files over here, one is the file which is for the US, the other one is consisting of the country is equal to India. So here let's create a file called gedit and client underscore India is the file, alright, wherein just this file enter the employee ID, I mean the client ID, which is some 111, and let's call him as a Ram, and let's call him as a 102, and let's call him as a Shiv. For example, you can enter these are all the comma separated values. These are all belongs to India partition. In the similar way, if you see the US partition, and here you will be entering the 101 John, Sam, Christine, and some values you are entering here. Just save these two files, and now what you need to do is just load that into the partitions. For that, just log into the Hive and execute load data value. See this load data local in path, and the one which we created client is equal to US over here. Either you can directly use the into table or else the overwrite. Overwrite will delete the previous ones and load this as a fresh. And whenever you are loading this data, similar to the previous modules, additional thing which you have to specify over here is which partition you are loading it. So as it is a static partition, you must need to enter these, the partition value as well. Like the one which I have mentioning over here, this is related to the US partition. So just enter this, it will load the data into the partition. Similar way, what you need to do, if you wanted to do it from the partition India, then you can directly enter the value over here. And also if you see the value, you have to specify the value as India here. That's it. If you are seeing your client details, everything will be loaded. See here, you can see the client ID, client name, and which country he is from. Similar way you can see. So the advantage is nothing but, so for example, if I go there and if I observe this, I can see a subfolders for the US and also for the India as well. So that whenever I execute any of the query like this, select start from client details where country is equal to US, for instance. Whenever we are having this kind of result, it will automatically fetches this. It will check that whether the partition exists on this specific column. As the partition we already created on the country is equal to US, it does not go through the each and every record. Simply it goes to that subfolder and it fetches that records as part of this. This is how you can see those values there. So to see the partitions, if you go to localhost colon 50070, you can directly click on this new tab, and here you can mention your localhost colon 50070. There you can see the browser health check page, and once you go into your utilities and browse the file system, you can see the new partitions created as part of your user Hive warehouse directory. User Hive warehouse is the directory, and as part of this we just created the client details folder. You can see here a client details table folder get created here. As it is a static partition, we have created at the time of loading itself, we have entered the country is equal to US and country is equal to India. So once I click on this subfolder, I can see a file client underscore US. That means the data which is belongs to all the client details from the United States. You can see it over here. Similar way, if I go back and you can see country is equal to India is a partition. This is another partition. Once you click there, you can see all the details. You can, if you want to see the details, just download that and save the file. You can see the same information which you have used to load the data into the system. This is how, as part of the static partition, you will be specifying these values upfront. You will be knowing your partition values upfront. And also, because why I'm saying upfront is nothing but here, as I already know that the country is equal to US is having these specific values, and similar way country is equal to India is having this specific value set. So that is the reason why we are loading like this. Here, unlike the static partition, the dynamic partition, you need not to know about any of the column values. If you just specify which column you wanted to put a partition. For example, in the country column, I wanted to place a partition. That's it. You need not even know what are all the values a country consisting of, whether it is India, US, Germany, it doesn't even matter. And also, as the name itself is saying, the dynamic. So what happens is, after some time, a new values are loaded into the those specific system where country is equal to new value came, which is China. So you need not create any of the partition. Automatically, a new partition gets created because the new value exists for that particular country column. So this is how automatically a new partitions are also get created on those specific columns. The subfolders gets created on those specific columns. And here, whatever the dynamic partition columns which we are specifying, it always need to be the last columns. So let me show you how we can load the data with the help of the dynamic partition. At that time, we'll also discuss why it should be the last columns. And here, as part of the dynamic partition example, what we do is, let's take a consumer complaints data set, which consisting of what are all the consumer complaints the report were loaded into the system. I mean, like whether it was submitted via the web or fax or email, or how exactly those each and every consumer complaint has been submitted. We are going to discuss about this consumer complaints example as part of the dynamic partition. So as part of the dynamic partition example, let me show you the how consumer complaints dataset looks like. I just logged into my Cloudera Quick Start VM, and this particular dataset has been attached to the video. You can directly download it to your computer and directly drag and drop that file into your Ubuntu Cloudera Quick Start VM. Otherwise, you can even attach to the email, and then even you can open your Gmail as part of this Cloudera as well. So once I open my terminal here, as part of the downloads, or let me just display that, do ls to display the content. It is just ls, and just go to the desktop, CD desktop, and on top of the desktop, we have just drag and drop our my consumer complaint.csv file. This is the input data file which we are going to handle. So if you wanted to display what exactly it looks like, you can even display the content with the help of the my consumer, right? My consumer complaints. .csv. Yeah, once I do a cat of my consumer complaints, this is a file which consisting of, and if you see this is the complaint date when this particular complaint has been received, and it's under which category, and also what is the description of the complaint and which state, zip code, and also the medium, like whether it is via the web or phone or fax. There are different mediums how we can submit each of the each of these consumer complaints. So this consisting of different mediums, and also then the zip code, and then which we will be having it as a complaint ID. So once you submit, a unique ID will be generated for you. So for instance, let's assume that here every time we are executing the queries with the help of these submitted via column, we wanted to know how these records have been submitted via the web or phone or fax or like that. So if you see this input file, then as every time we are executing via this medium, so we call that as a partition column. You can take that column as a partition column. So how we are going to create those things are nothing but, first of all, log into your Hive, and then let's create a table, consumer complaints table, and then as I mentioned you that this is a dynamic partition. So this dynamic partition must need to be a last column. So that is the reason why to make it the last column, because every time whenever you see the data set, your dynamic partition column will not be a last column. If you see this, the last column is the consumer ID, the complaint ID. But on this particular last before column, we are going to put a which we are going to put a dynamic partition. So first of all, we are going to load this data into the one of the table, and once this data loaded into that table, then we will be creating a partition on top of this particular column, and then we will be loading it as a last column. For that purpose, I've just copied the content of the consumer complaint table creation statement, and you can see here create table. This is the table name, consumer complaint table, which we are creating, and which consisting of all the details like date, product, issue, state, zip code, submitted via, and CCIDs, consumer complaint IDs. This is related to all the column values, columns, whatever you are seeing it over here. And if you see this, how our fields are terminated, these are separated with the comma. So we have given the commas there. The lines are terminated by the new line. So it is done. Now we have to load the data into the consumer complaint table. And here to load the data, I've just executed the load data local info, and this is the content my consumer complaint.csv. So we are loading that data into this consumer complaints table. And if you wanted to cross verify that whether it is loaded or not, you can see that by executing consumer select start from consumer complaints, and these are the some of the details which you got. And now I wanted to put a partition column on top of this last but one. So this is the consumer complaint form. So you can see some of the records with the web and some other records via the phone also. These consumer complaints has been recorded. So for that we have just created a CC partition table, and here how we are creating the partition data is nothing but with the help of the partition by clause we are specifying what is the column name which partition has to be available. And also these are all the columns which you will be having it. And there is a one restriction that always the partition column has to be the last column. So that is the reason why we have kept this as the last column. And now before executing any of the dynamic partition, before loading any of the content to the dynamic partition, there are two different modes are available. One is a strict and non-strict mode. So what we have to do is we have to change it to the non-strict, because the reason is whatever the partition columns, dynamic partition columns which we are having it, if it is in a strict mode, at least one partition column has to be the static. That is the reason why what we are doing here is we are disabling that. That means by making it to non-strict mode. These are all the parameters which we are setting it. Set Hive execution dynamic partition to true and also dynamic partition mode to the non-strict mode. And once this is done, we are all set to load our data. And now we have just executed the insert statement. What exactly it is doing here is insert whatever the partition table which we created, consumer complaints underscore partition, cc underscore partition. And here, if you see the select statement, every time we are mentioning the last column has to be the partition column. That means in this select statement, if you observe, the submitted via is the partition column. This has to be the last column. So instead of the load statement, we are using the insert statement because already the data is available in the consumer complaint table, and from there we are loading into the CC partition table. In your input file, if the data is always, if the partition column is always the last column, you can directly load it with the help of the load statement. Otherwise, you have to specify or load the data into the one of the table and then load it like it with the help of the insert statement. So the map reduce job got executed behind the scene and it is successful. Once I go back here and if I open my browser health check page, utilities, and browse the file system, and if I go to my user Hive warehouse directory, you can see a table called a CC partition table. That is a partition table. Right here, user Hive warehouse is the table. CC underscore partition is the partition table, and if you observe this, you can see the submitted via is equal to phone, submitted via is equal to web, or like that. You can see those values as well. So if I go into the phone, you can see a data set. You temporarily download the data set, and if you see this value, you can see a single record, because in our input data file, if you observe our input data file, which is this, and here only the last one is via the phone, right? The same one which has been downloaded into here. That means in simple words, while creating the partitions of folders, it will place those subfolder values into this. Submitted y is equal to phone, submitted y is equal to web, and suppose if someone added the new record via submitted y is equal to fax, you can see another partition submitted y is equal to fax also. This is what a dynamic partition does. Automatically it creates the partitions. And the advantage over here is nothing but, suppose if I am executing a query, select start from cc underscore partition table where submitted via is equal to web. What it does is, instead of navigating across the million records, it will simply verify whether the partition exists on top of this column, and then simply it goes and fetches those records from there. Right, web is a string. Whether it is a capital web or small web, let me just see. Yes, W is capital. That is the reason why it is not display you any of the records. See here, you can see all the records which consisting of the web. That means whichever are submitted via the web. This is how dynamic partition works. And also, if any of the partitions are there and if you wanted to alter any of the partition, like new partition to be added or dropped or anything, with the help of the alter table command, we can uh, do such kind of things like having your alter table add partition. You can even add the new partitions and drop the partitions, and you can do any of these things with the help of the alter table. Similar way how your alter table works, the same way you can add and drop partitions like this. Drop the partition is nothing but it deletes the partition columns, whatever it is there. Recover the partition is nothing but, suppose if you directly went to the HDFS, like user Hive warehouse directory or whatever the external location you are having, and you directly created a subfolder there. Manually you created a subfolder there, and you want that to be let the system also know, Hive also know about this schema, whichever is newly added, values are added. So for that, you will be running this recover partition. This is the command alter table name recover partition. So this will, what it does is it will simply verifies that whatever the new things which are added as part of your Hadoop distributed file system, that gets reflected into your meta store. That is, the metadata is also get updated. So if you see the important point for the Hive, especially here you must need, and not only the one, even you can have the multiple subpartitions as well. The similar way, you can just, wherever you are having a partition by clause, you can put a comma there, and you can even have add the multiple partition column values as well for the subpartitions. So as we mentioned you that instead of doing the table full scan, what it does is it simply directly goes to that particular specific subfolder and it fetches those values. And here, whenever we are working on the dynamic partition, we have to be very careful, because again, creating a smaller partitions also leads to the performance degradation. That is the reason why choosing a specific column is also very, very important. If you suppose if I'm choosing a specific partition column as a complaint ID is unique. So obviously it is going to create a lot of subfolders. So it is taking up a lot of time, and you can see the performance degradation on top of that. So choosing a partition column is very, very important. So in this module, we have understand that what is partition and what types of the partitions which we are having, static and the dynamic partitions. And we understand that how it is improving the performance with the help of your partitioning. And also we have seen the commands for dropping the partitions and altering the partitions and recovering the partitions as well. Thank you. Let's catch up in the next module.